Gavin Sinclair's mornings were as predictable as the skyline he owned. The glass elevator carried him upwards through his empire every day, humming softly as it sliced through 40 floors of ambition. He lived in a world where silence was broken only by the clicking of expensive shoes against marble and the echo of deals being closed. His penthouse office looked down on millions, yet inside it was hollow, the kind of place where even laughter seemed out of place. To outsiders, he was in viable tailored Italian suits, a jawline hardened from years of clenched decisions, and the aura of a man who could buy anything. But those closest to him knew the truth. Gavin trusted no one. The betrayal in his youth had carved a scar so deep that it wasn't just mistrust of people, but mistrust of emotions themselves. His fiancée's calculated treachery had taught him that love wasn't a gift, it was leverage. That single act turned him into the man the city feared, a man who valued results over relationships, loyalty over love. His company thrived under that cold philosophy. Every week was another acquisition, another business folded into Sinclair Enterprises. Board members would beam at his brilliance while secretly whispering that he was unapproachable, untouchable. But Gavin preferred it that way. Fear, he believed, was honest. Admiration was just another mask. Still, every victory rang hollow. The more his empire grew, the more he noticed the silence waiting for him at night. Empty rooms, expensive art on walls, and a glass of scotch as his only companion. Even he knew, though he would never admit it, that money echoed loudly but never filled the silence. The care home was an entirely different universe. Instead of polished steel and gleaming marble, there were linoleum floors, the faint hum of wheelchairs, and walls decorated with watercolor paintings made by residents. Gavin had never liked visiting. The antiseptic smell reminded him of how far Henry had fallen from the strong, broad-shouldered man who once carried him on fishing trips. Yet that afternoon was different. Before he even reached the garden, he heard something he hadn't heard in years. His grandfather's laughter. Not polite chuckles, not forced conversation, real, unguarded laughter that came from deep within the chest. Gavin froze, struck by the sound. When he reached the doorway, the scene unfolded like something out of another life. His grandfather, frail and bent with age, was walking slowly along the path, guided by a nurse who held his arm with such gentleness it made the world stop. She wasn't beautiful in the glamorous sense Gavin was used to, but there was something radiant about her. Her smile wasn't practiced, her laugh wasn't calculated, it was pure. Nora Ellis. She didn't flinch at his expensive watch or the way the air seemed to shift when he entered the space. Most people looked at him and saw a name, a bank account, a chance to get closer. But when Nora looked at him, she saw something no one else had in years. A grandson, standing in the garden beside his aging grandfather. Gavin noticed the little things, the way she knelt to talk to a woman in a wheelchair at eye level, the way she remembered small details about the residents, the way her laughter softened the atmosphere like music. It wasn't in her job description to care like this, but she did. Not for recognition, not for reward, simply because it mattered. In that garden, surrounded by roses and ancient oaks, Gavin felt the weight of guilt settle on him. How many weeks had it been since his last visit? How many deals had he chosen over Henry's stories, over his fading strength? Watching Nora made him realize what he had neglected, and the shame cut deeper than any business loss ever could. That night, back in his penthouse with the city sprawled beneath him, Gavin felt restless. Normally, he'd pour himself a drink, open his laptop, and drown himself in spreadsheets until the silence faded into sleep. But tonight, he couldn't focus. His mind kept circling back to that smile. Nora Ellis, kneeling in the garden dirt, unbothered by status, unshaken by his presence, had planted something inside him he hadn't felt in years. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. But the truth was heavier. For the first time in a long while, he wanted to know Semyon, not because of what they could bring to his empire, but because of who they were. By morning, his resolve had already shifted. He dug through old drawers until he found Ida fishing rod, worn and dusty, still carrying the scent of the summers he and Henry once shared at Lake Whitney. He hadn't touched it in years. Carrying it felt foreign, like holding a memory he wasn't sure he deserved anymore. When he returned to Sunset Grove, Henry's face lit up at the sight of the rod. "Thought you'd forgotten how to fish," his grandfather teased, voice cracked but bright. Gavin sat beside him, but his eyes wandered toward the art room, where Nora was leading a group of residents. She didn't just manage the room, she filled it with life. "More water, Mrs. Chen. Let the colors breathe," she said gently, adjusting a paintbrush in an old woman's hand. Her wrist bore streaks of blue paint, her bun was loose, and her laughter filled the space with warmth. Gavin stood at the doorway, feeling strangely like an intruder in her world. When she noticed him, she didn't smile with charm or tilt her head the way women at galas always did. Instead, she simply asked if he wanted to join. Handing him a blank sheet of paper and watercolors, she told him, "We're painting memories." Gavin resisted at first, fumbling with the brush, but eventually dipped it into blue and began painting the dock from that old photo he kept hidden in a drawer. Nora leaned over, adjusting his grip. Her breath carried the faint scent of mint. "Loosen up. It's not a boardroom." He glanced at her, unsettled by how much weight those words carried. She wasn't just talking about painting. She was talking about his life. By the time the class ended, Gavin's painting was clumsy, but Henry's wobbly strokes beside him had never looked more proud. And as Nora gathered brushes, Gavin realized that the empire he had built, one that stretched over city, had never given him the feeling he got sitting in that small art room, watching her. Gavin Sinclair had lived in two worlds his entire life. One was steel and glass, where numbers mattered more than names, and where the worth of a man was measured in quarterly reports. The other was smaller, quieter, filled with the memory of fishing trips, garden soil, and the warmth of his grandfather's laughter. For years, he had buried that second world deep inside him, convincing himself that sentiment was a liability. But after Nora, the lines between those two worlds began to blur. He found himself returning to Sunset Grove more often, sometimes under the excuse of bringing Henry new books, sometimes with a fishing rod, sometimes with nothing at all. The staff grew accustomed to seeing him in the halls, surprised at how different he looked there. Away from the skyscrapers, his eyes softened, his tone lost its sharp edge. Residents smiled at him, curious about this tall man who suddenly appeared to listen instead of command. But they all knew the truth. He wasn't just there for Henry. At the same time, the cracks in his other world were beginning to show. In the boardroom, Victoria Chambers watched him with hawk-like precision. She was ambitious, cunning, and the perfect product of the Sinclair Empire's ruthlessness. To her, Gavin's recent distractions weren't just odd, they were dangerous. She leaned close during one meeting, whispering that his focus seemed to be slipping. The implication was clear, and Gavin knew what she was really asking: who was taking his attention? When he extended an invitation to Nora for the Sinclair Enterprises charity gala, it was impulsive. He wanted her to see his world, to prove to himself and maybe to her that he wasn't ashamed of who he was. He wanted to bridge the distance, to see what it looked like to bring her into the glittering halls of his empire. But the moment he saw her modest sedan pull up to the Grand Plaza Hotel, doubt clawed at him. She stepped out in a borrowed emerald gown, hesitant and graceful, curls pinned up with a few strands framing her face. She looked at the flashing cameras with uncertainty, and he reached for her hand quickly. "You look stunning," he murmured, his voice softer than he intended. She whispered back, "I feel like I don't belong here." Gavin squeezed her hand and replied, "You're the only one who does." But the whispers started before they even crossed the marble floor. Executives, politicians, socialites all turned their heads, wondering why Gavin Sinclair, the man rumored to be untouchable, was walking in with a nurse from a care home. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers glittered like constellations. Waiters glided across the floor with trays of champagne, and a string quartet played music that was elegant but distant. Gavin guided Nora past the clusters of donors, ignoring the questioning stares. He wanted her to feel comfortable, but her eyes darted around the room, catching every diamond necklace, every whispered conversation. "This must cost a fortune," she murmured. "Raise over $1 million for children's education," Gavin replied, hoping the number would impress her. But her response cut deeper than he expected. "How much of that actually reaches the kids after all this?" she asked, her gaze lingering on the towering floral displays and the stage lit with spotlights. Gavin hesitated. For the first time, he realized he didn't know. And then Victoria appeared, as if summoned by the tension. Dressed in crimson silk, her smile gleamed sharp as a blade. She looked Nora up and down and said, "And you are?" Nora straightened her shoulders and replied, "Nora Ellis. I care for Gavin's grandfather at Sunset Grove." Victoria's lips curved into a condescending smile. How noble! The words were meant as dismissal, but Nora held her ground. She wasn't intimidated, and Gavin noticed. But then the governor called for him, and duty pulled him away. He promised Nora he'd be quick, but when he returned minutes later, she sat rigid at their table, her plate untouched. Victoria was seated nearby, her laughter like venom. Nora whispered, everyone staring. Gavin squeezed her hand beneath the table, grounding himself in her callous touch. "They're just jealous," he whispered back. When the music shifted, Gavin asked her to dance. She shook her head nervously. "Am no ballroom dancer." "Neither am I," he admitted. "I just want to hold you." On the dance floor, the crowd faded. For one perfect moment, it was just the two of them. Gavin leaned down slowly, giving her space, and she met him halfway. The kiss was soft, hesitant, but it cracked something wide open inside him. He whispered, "I've wanted that for weeks." She breathed back, "Me too." But the moment didn't last. Victoria reappeared, tapping Gavin's shoulder, reminding him of the governor. When he returned, Nora was gone. A text blinked on his phone. "Not feeling well. Thanks for inviting me." Formal, distant. And Gavin knew Victoria had poisoned the night. The next morning, Gavin confessed everything to Henry. His grandfather listened quietly, then said, "Your grandmother Ruth was a waitress when I met her. People told me she wasn't enough. But love isn't a merger. It's showing up hard and all." "What do you want, Gavin?" For once, Gavin didn't hesitate. "I want her," he admitted. And Henry smiled knowingly. "Then fight for her." Fighting for her meant fighting for himself. When Victoria tried to corner him with threats about old scandals, Gavin didn't bend. With Henry by his side, he called a special board meeting and unveiled a new vision. Sinclair Enterprises would no longer be a hollow empire of greed. It would invest in communities, build affordable housing, fund real education. "This isn't charity," he said firmly. "It's smart business. Companies with heart last longer." Some members scoffed, but Henry's presence at his side turned the tide. One by one, the board shifted toward Gavin. Victoria's allies dwindled. In the end, she was the one ousted, her ambitions crushed under the weight of a company rediscovering its soul. But victory in the boardroom wasn't enough. Gavin needed to prove, not just to Nora, but to himself, that he had truly changed. And so, at the community garden's summer festival, he made his move. The festival was alive with collard tomatoes heavy on their vines, marigolds bursting with orange flame, children darting through sprinklers as folk music played. Gavin had spent weeks helping behind the scenes, bringing in restaurants to donate food, securing artisans to display crafts, quietly funding the irrigation system that now watered the crops. For once, his name wasn't on a banner. He wanted the spotlight on the community, not himself. When Nora approached with 2 glasses of lemonade, her sundress swaying in the warm air, Gavin felt the world slow down. She teased him about looking lighter, and he realized she was right. He wasn't carrying the same armor anymore. He led her to the edge of the garden, where the vacant lot once sat empty. Now, a simple sign read, "Future home of the community greenhouse." Nora's eyes widened. "You bought the lot?" she whispered. Gavin nodded. "For the garden. For you." Build the space you dreamed of. Make it what this neighborhood needs." Her hands trembled as she held his, tears filling her eyes. Gavin dropped to one knee, pulling a velvet box from his pocket. "Nora Ellis," he said, voice steady but raw, "you've shown me wealth isn't money. It's love shared and grown. Be my partner in this, and in everything." The crowd hushed. Children stopped mid-run. Elders leaned in closer, and Henry, standing proudly with his walker, raised a fist in triumph. Nora pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks, before nodding. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking into laughter. "Yes, I will." The festival erupted into cheers. Maya, Nora's protective sister, shouted, "About time, Sinclair." Henry laughed so hard he had to steady himself. And Gavin, for the first time in his life, felt truly rich not in money, but in belonging. Ryan Caldwell's life moved on rails laid by other People chauffeurs, assistants, advisors, yet he was the one who seemed most determined never to arrive anywhere personal. The Caldwell name opened the doors of art museums after hours, got private tastings at restaurants booked for months, and turned crowded sidewalks into parted seas. But when the doors closed and the rooms went quiet, he lived with the echo. He ate standing at a kitchen island made of stone head picked from a catalog. He slept with the television on for the noise. He kept 2 toothbrushes in the marble holder and never needed the second. The only ritual that made sense was the drive to the hospice on the Upper East Side. He went in the late afternoons, when the sky over the East River turned the color of a bruise and the building lights blinked on one by one. The lobby always smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee. Receptionists learned to nod him through without asking for ID. He stopped at the little cafe just off the elevators, buying 2 teas out of habit, though Harold rarely finished his. He'd sit by the bed, talking softly about the Knicks or a headline, filling the room with a steady voice in case memory was listening. Harold had been the house's gravity for most of Ryan's life, man who made scrambled eggs on Sundays, who wrote notes in the margins of library books and said things like, "Money is a tool, not a goal." When the divorce detonated the Caldwell household, Harold never asked Ryan to choose sides. He just showed up for school pickups, science fairs, and the days Ryan didn't want to get out of bed. Watching that same man lie small against white sheets was a lesson Ryan didn't know how to pass. On the rainy afternoon that bent the arc of his life, rain tugged at the window in silver strings. Ryan arrived early, the hall outside Harold's room quiet except for a housekeeping cart rattling by. He lifted his hand to push the door and froze. There, in the thin light, a young nurse sat at the bedside, her hands folded over Harold's, speaking in a tone that made the room feel like a porch swing in summer. She had set a vase with 3 roses on the sill, even though roses weren't on any supply list, and a small speaker on the tray table let a soft piano piece rise and fall just enough sound to make silence kind. Harold was watching her, mouth tilted, eyes awake in a way Ryan hadn't seen in months. When she laughed, his shoulders actually shifted with an answering chuckle. It wasn't a Miraclano thunder, no swelling music, but it was something gentler, and to Ryan, stranger, ease. He stood there, hand on the doorframe, trying to name what he felt. Relief, yes. Gratitude, yes. But also a tug behind the ribs, a pull toward the person who had made this possible. He didn't interrupt. He let the scene unfold and learned her name later from the head nurse at the station. Grace. She had started 2 weeks earlier and had a way of coaxing reluctant words from people who had stopped trusting their tongues. The staff said she remembered everyone's favorite drink, which radio station to set, which daughter lived out of state and shouldn't be reminded. It wasn't dazzling. It was faithful. And it mattered more than dazzling ever had. Ryan took the chair by the window when Grace stepped out and didn't mention what he'd seen. Instead, he sat quietly and watched Harold's chest move. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the pressure to fix anything. He just felt the rightness of being there. Outside, the rain tapped its soft metronome on the glass, and inside, Harold slept with the ghost of a smile still touching his mouth. Ryan looked at the roses on the sill and understood that someone had brought the garden back into a room that smelled of bleach and breath. He left that evening with the odd sensation of having found a door he hadn't known existed. He didn't open it. Not yet. He just stood on the porch and listened.